On this Sunday night, the consequences for a Canadian in China. Michael Kovrig goes on trial accused of spying.
A supposed trial, an alleged trial that doesn't meet the basic standard of fairness.
Once again, Canadian diplomats are denied access. Miami's emergency. The curfew to rein in rowdy spring break crowds. Racist reputation. The Canadian city working to eliminate divisions. Plus, reflections of war. Refugees in Canada look back at 10 years of conflict in Syria.
Global National with Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. In just a few hours, Michael Kovrig will face a judge in Beijing charged with espionage. And like the trial for Michael Spavor, no Canadian officials will be allowed in court to watch the proceedings. The arrest of the two Canadians is widely seen as retribution for the detention of Meng Wanzhou in British Columbia at the request of the U.S. And today, China had another contemptuous message for Canada. Abigail Bimman reports.
A former Canadian ambassador to China says Michael Spavor's connection to the North Korean leader will likely be used against Michael Kovrig during Monday's trial.
The Chinese consider North Korea as theirs, and we know that Spavor had met with Kovrig and passed on information, but it's very easy for the Chinese to pretend that this was secret information.
But we won't know what happens in court. China won't let any Canadian officials inside, just like at Spavor's trial.
The one advantage that Michael Kovrig has is that his Mandarin is better than Michael Spavor, so he'll be able to follow in more detail what is happening.
A supposed trial, an alleged trial that doesn't meet the basic standard of fairness, of respect for the rule of law.
On the West Block with Mercedes Stephenson, Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc maintains the best way forward is to work with other allies. But in terms of getting tougher on China,
we are not ruling out any action necessary.
Yet another new statement from the Chinese embassy, this time taking aim at comments Thursday from the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Ottawa. The Chinese writing, "The United States is the culprit and Canada is the accomplice." Many see the timing of the trials as an effort by China to use the Canadians as a bargaining chip with the U.S. But this week's first meeting between China and the new Biden administration was rocky.
Unfortunately, I think Donald Trump, as president, when he implied that he could maybe make a deal with Meng Wanzhou early on, has probably led some in China to believe, if we're tough enough, this will enter into it, because they do desperately want her back.
Global Affairs Canada says China is obligated to provide trial access to Canadian consular officials, and it remains deeply troubled by the lack of transparency. Experts say Kovrig may see more support outside his trial, with more diplomats physically present in Beijing than Dandong, where Spavor was tried. Robin?
Abigail Bimman in Ottawa. Thanks, Abigail. The campaign to protect Canadians against COVID-19 is picking up steam. Nearly 4 million vaccinations have now been administered, but there's still a long way to go. The federal government may be in charge of the supply, but it's up to the provinces and territories to get shots into arms. As Heather Yourex-West reports, some regions are having more success than others.
Essential workers are among those now getting immunized against COVID-19 in BC.
It just means a lot to me, given that I'm in direct patient contact every day with people of various ages, so I can protect them.
Next door in Alberta, doses are delivered to people based mainly on age. Just one of many differences between Canada's provinces and territories, as every jurisdiction pushes towards the same goal.
We are worried that with increasing variants of concern on circulation, the goal is to get everybody vaccinated as soon as possible.
We asked Dr. Brian Conway, the medical director of the Vancouver Infectious Disease Centre, to give each province's rollout plan a grade. Getting top marks, Yukon, Nunavut and Manitoba, followed by the Northwest Territories and Ontario.
If you actually look at the 3 northern territories right now, we see that well over a quarter of the populations have been vaccinated. That might even be higher than that right now. Whereas in the rest of Canada, you're talking about, maybe just about 5% at the moment.
Conway has given BC and Quebec a C, Nova Scotia a D, and he's graded the plans from Alberta, Saskatchewan, PEI, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador as incomplete.
The structures aren't necessarily yet in place, or at least people don't feel comfortable putting them on paper in terms of the structures that will be required to vaccinate 2 to 2.5 million Canadians per week.
The vaccine rollout is still in an early stage, and as supplies increase, every province and territory will be tested more and more. Missteps may be unavoidable, but Dr. Conway says provinces who can course correct quickly and learn from the experiences of their neighbors will likely have the most success.
Almost on a daily basis to ask, what are we doing? What are we doing better? What can we do better tomorrow than we're doing today? And let's share that with all Canadians.
Because with millions of Canadians still unprotected, this vaccine rollout has a long way to go. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
A state of emergency has been declared in Miami Beach, where spring break crowds have been getting out of control. Florida is the third state in the U.S. to see over 2 million cases of COVID-19. And massive groups of young people not wearing masks were too much for city leaders, who are now taking extreme measures. Jennifer Johnson reports.
Miami Beach police are taking drastic measures to enforce a new 8 p.m. curfew as spring breakers overwhelm the city. Massive crowds of young people, with few wearing masks, have city leaders fearing this will become another super spreader event.
If you saw the photos of Ocean Drive, it was quite simply overwhelming. It looked like a rock concert. You couldn't see pavement and you couldn't see grass. So we feel that this is necessary.
For weeks, federal health officials begged spring breakers to be careful, but many aren't listening.
We love Miami. We out here.
New cases of COVID-19 are decreasing in Florida, but rising in at least 20 states. In other parts of the country, cases are plateauing.
That is not a good thing. When you have that plateauing, that's usually the forerunner of another surge.
Despite millions of COVID cases, Florida has remained relatively open. Officials fear the word got out.
I think the volume is clearly more than it's been in previous years. That, I think, is in part due to the fact that there are very few places open elsewhere in the country.
Roads to the South Beach party area are now shut down after 8, something desperate bar and restaurant owners didn't want to see. But police were losing control of the crowds.
We've done everything we can to try to mitigate the behavior that we're seeing. But quite frankly, I'm concerned that the behavior is getting a little bit more for us to be able to handle.
The message now to spring breakers, go home, as South Florida now braces for a potential wave of new COVID-19 cases. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
There were rallies against racism in major cities today to condemn attacks on members of Asian American communities. Hundreds of demonstrators filled New York's Union Square, calling out anti-Asian hate in the aftermath of the Atlanta shootings. 6 of the 8 victims were of Asian heritage. Protests also took place in Montreal, where a large crowd took to the streets to denounce violence targeting people of Asian descent. The RCMP plans to act on recommendations outlined in a review of how officers acted following the killing of an Indigenous man in 2016. Global News obtained 2 reports which say Mounties made disparaging, racist remarks to Colton Bushy's mother while breaking the news of her son's death. The 22-year-old was killed during an altercation with a farmer on a rural property in Saskatchewan. But as Global's Nathaniel Dove reports, the union representing Mounties is critical of the findings.
A civilian watchdog says the RCMP discriminated against the mother of Colton Bushy on the night of his 2016 death. 2 reports from the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission found officers acted inappropriately while speaking with Debbie Baptiste, and they had asked if she had been drinking. The review was obtained by Global News before publication. The RCMP's commissioner accepted most of the findings. The officers' union, however, is more critical. The National Police Federation says the review dismisses or outright ignores central facts and evidence. It calls the RCMP's acceptance of the inaccuracies demeaning to members in Saskatchewan and beyond, and this injustice needs to be called out. One lawyer says the conduct of officers and the union's response shows things haven't changed.
I think that it belies the same sort of uncaring attitude. And these scathing findings are not really surprising for First Nations people, sadly.
Donald Worm represented the family of Neil Stonechild in the investigation into his 1990 death. That probe suggested Saskatoon police abandoned the teen in a field on a night when temperatures were close to minus 30 degrees. The denial of racism and wrongdoing in the Bushy case adds further injury. The RCMP says it is implementing all recommendations in the Bushy review. However, one activist working as an advisor for the Halifax Police Board says that, too, misses the mark.
We have seen a complete abdication of responsibility, an inability to have any accountability, and in many cases, an excusing of the police and a blaming of the victims.
Both L. Jones and Worms say meaningful reform must involve Indigenous and local community engagement. They say police can't just be accountable to themselves. Nathaniel Dove, Global News, Saskatoon.
The city of Winnipeg has launched its first ever Anti-Racism Week. The event is aimed at improving the city's reputation when it comes to discrimination. 6 years ago, Maclean's magazine labeled it as the place where Canada's racism problem is at its worst. Marnie Blunt reports on the steps the city is taking to eliminate the racial divides.
My wife is Ukrainian heritage. My family's Métis. I want my boys to be as proud of both of those family lines.
A tearful reaction from Winnipeg's mayor, following the Maclean's magazine article dubbing Winnipeg as Canada's most racist city. Fast forward 6 years later.
We don't need bystanders in the work of reconciliation or anti-racism. We need active participants to combat overt acts of racism.
Now the mayor is launching the city's first ever Anti-Racism Week. Advocates say there is still a lot of work to be done, and dialogue is the first step.
Maclean's article in this context at least did spur some change. Maybe it might not be as fast as some would like to see. I would be in that context for sure, but at least it provided some mechanism to encourage dialogue and discourse and direction to address racism in Winnipeg.
Winnipeg is still afflicted with its challenges. More murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, a report outlining racial bias among firefighters, and an Indigenous teenager shot and killed by police, prompting calls for justice from the family.
I will not stop fighting for my daughter.
No, there's no progress. Generally, awareness by non-Indigenous people has gone up. Plains story, it still works here. It still works here. Even our scholars, our world scholars, point to Manitoba in order to study racism and to work to eliminate racism.
But Dr. Lavallee says despite that, there is still action being taken to fight racism.
But it's a start. Again, if we can say the word racism instead of cultural safety or humility or discrimination, it's really important for us to name the thing.
The week also includes mandatory anti-oppression training for more than 10,000 city employees, something Winnipeg's mayor says is a step towards addressing systemic racism and complicit bias within government. Marnie Blunt, Global News, Winnipeg.
Coming up, will the U.S. get the herd immunity it needs? Australia has declared a natural disaster in New South Wales, where record-breaking rain and floods are being described as a once-in-a-century event. Some areas have now seen over 300 millimeters of rain since Friday. It caused a major dam west of Sydney to overflow. Evacuations and rescue efforts are underway for thousands of residents, but officials warn fatalities are inevitable. More than 43 million Americans are now fully vaccinated. That's 13% of the population. And like everywhere else in the world, there's a race to get more shots to more people to outrun those more contagious variants. But the bigger problem may be the Americans who refuse vaccines entirely. As Jackson Prosco reports, that could potentially keep the U.S. from achieving herd immunity.
By late May, there will be enough vaccine for every American who wants one. The problem is, millions don't.
I'm not getting the vaccine because I'm honestly not scared of the virus.
I don't trust the vaccine at all.
Polls suggest a large number of Americans will refuse a vaccine. Most of them are Republicans, supporters of former President Donald Trump.
How some groups would not want to do it for reasons that I just don't understand.
While only 11% of Democrats said they would refuse a vaccine, that number rises to 41% of Republicans, including half of Republican men. Enough to potentially keep the U.S. from reaching herd immunity.
We're just going to still be living with COVID precautions. We're going to be living with cases, and we're still going to be living with people getting severely ill and dying of COVID-19.
There are things we don't know about the effects of this vaccine.
Conservative audiences have been bombarded with vaccine misinformation.
Get vaccinated.
While former President Trump was the only one of the 5 living past presidents not to get vaccinated on camera. This week, he broke his silence and admitted there's a problem.
I would recommend it to a lot of people that don't want to get it, and a lot of those people voted for me, frankly.
In fact, the vaccines were developed with the support of the Trump administration. 2 of the 3 shots used in the U.S. were given FDA approval while Trump was still president.
It's clear that the virus doesn't care whom you voted for or if you voted at all. And therefore, we would like to extend the protection of the vaccines to as many people as possible.
The Biden administration is planning a $1.5 billion campaign to promote vaccine acceptance. Much of the messaging will focus on having trusted community leaders sell the safety of the shots in an urgent push to take the politics out of the biggest public health effort in a generation. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Still ahead, the war in Syria 10 years on, how one of the 21st century's deadliest conflicts began. Ten years ago, hundreds of Syrians took to the streets to demonstrate against President Bashar al-Assad. The peaceful protest quickly turned into deadly clashes with police and eventually spiraled into a full-scale civil war. As Mike Armstrong explains, the conflict has now dragged on longer than the First and Second World Wars combined.
It has been a life lived in conflict. Mohammed Abu Radin was born in northern Syria 10 years ago as the country started to fall apart. With each year, things have gotten worse. Mohammed says he used to live in a house and go to school. Both were destroyed. Now, that story isn't just one of many, it's one of millions. The conflict in Syria has meant suffering on an industrial scale. A British-based group, the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, estimates that as of this month, more than 2.1 million have been injured and more than 594,000 killed.
They have been dispossessed of their lands and homes.
The United Nations Special Envoy for Syria briefed the UN Security Council Monday. He called the Syrian people among the greatest victims of this century after a decade of bombings, gassings, and starvation.
They have been injured, maimed, and killed in every way imaginable. Their corpses even desecrated.
The conflict started at the beginning of March 2011. The southern city of Dara is sometimes called the cradle of the revolution. 15 students were arrested for anti-government graffiti. Within days, protests exploded. Within months, defectors created the Free Syrian Army. And by 2013, refugees were pouring out of the country in every direction. 5.5 million Syrians are displaced inside the country. Another 6 million left.
They have fled Syria, often only to face further poverty and discrimination, or worse, perishing at sea in search of refuge.
This was a rally in northwestern Syria last week to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the uprising. It's one of only 2 small regions still controlled by rebel forces. Turkish troops control an area in the north and Kurdish forces in the northeast, but government forces now control close to 70% of the country. Propped up by Russian troops, President Bashar al-Assad has regained much of the territory he'd lost. There has been a calm in the fighting in recent months, but many expect Assad to make a move on rebel-controlled areas. The only question, some say, is when. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
Up next, Mike Armstrong's coverage continues with the wounds of Syria's war in Canada. As As we heard before the break, millions of Syrians have left their country since the start of the conflict 10 years ago. Included in that wave, more than 80,000 who settled here in Canada. As Mike Armstrong explains, they may have found safety in this country, but the stress of what's happening back home hasn't gone away.
Today we are preparing kebab.
They are thousands of kilometers from the conflict, but it is never far from their thoughts. These women are from Syria, now living in Canada, working at a catering company, Les Filles Fatouches. Its specialty is Syrian cuisine. Asked how often they think about what's going on back in Syria, Nourma Ghanem says every day.
Chaque jour.
And then corrects herself.
Chaque moment.
Every moment, she says. While the fighting in Syria has calmed in recent months, the situation for people on the ground hasn't improved. In some regions, unemployment is running as high as 80 and 90%. That as the cost of everything has skyrocketed.
La guerre est une catastrophe.
The news about Syria, our Pixvalian says, is hard to watch.
Non, quelquefois je pleure.
She says it sometimes makes her cry and that she doesn't see a solution coming.
We import...
The company was started by Adel Tarzabachi. She's been importing soap and spices from Syria for years. When refugees started arriving in Canada, she wanted to help them. Well, it's also helping the families these women left behind. They almost all send about a quarter of the money they make back to Syria, even though it's hard.
They need the money. Even though they need the money, they are like obliged to think of their family because they feel guilty that they leave them there.
Tarzabachi was raised in the city of Aleppo. Today, much of it is in ruins. When she calls people back in Syria, she often hears tears at the other end of the line and people pleading for help to move to Canada. The 10th anniversary of the start of the conflict may be a time for reflection, Tarzabachi says, but it doesn't feel like a time for optimism.
Before we had like a bit of hope. Right now, it's even that bit of hope, we don't see it.
Tarzabachi says many of the Syrian refugees around the world planned on someday moving back, even some who came to Canada. With every year that passes, that dream, she says, is dying. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Robin Gill. Tonight, your Canada is a frozen waterfall in Alberta's Waterton Lakes National Park. Thank you for watching. Good night.